From London, this is the Orwellians podcast. I'm Roland Elliott Brown. My guests today are Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogan. Andrei and Irina are investigative journalists and experts on the Russian intelligence agencies. They've reported on Putin's Russia since the beginning of Putin's first presidential term in the year 2000. They're the co-founders of Agentura.ru, whose name means Ring of Spies, and they are now senior fellows at the Center for European Policy Analysis and visiting staff at the King's Center for the Study of Intelligence. They moved to London in 2020 following an apparent threat to Andrei's life and have written a new book, Our Dear Friends in Moscow, The Inside Story of a Broken Generation. The book describes both the pressure on Russian journalists throughout the Putin era and, in some cases, their susceptibility to an emerging imperial ideology. Andrei and Irina, welcome.
Hi, Roland, and thank you for having us.
Hi.
So my first question, your book begins with your time at the newspaper Izvestia. This was a paper that had been a propaganda outlet for the Soviet government throughout the Soviet period, but had undergone some major reforms throughout the Gorbachev and Yeltsin years while maintaining good access to the Kremlin. Maybe you could start by telling us about your early days there, what the paper was like in the year 2000, and what your ambitions were when you joined it.
The newspaper was not so bad as it used to be in the Soviet Union. So remember, the 90s was an amazing time of media freedom. And to that point, Izvestia was owned by oligarchs. So, and when we came there, we thought that we were experienced journalists. We had 4-year experience in liberal newspaper called Сегодня. And we were 24, 25 years old, so quite young, but by then Russian standards, we could be considered as experienced journalists. So we had some experience as reporters reporting on the security services, war conflicts. We worked for criminal section of the newspaper, so this kind of things. And Andrei, he started as a business journalist covering the internet issues, which was kind of very posh back then. But the point of 2000, at this time, we felt that we need to leave our old newspaper and went to a new place because we were desperate for more contact sources close to the power, which means the Kremlin, the security services, these kind of things. And remember that this year, Putin, who was a former KGB officer, came to power. So that's why we went to this newspaper. And what we found out there was not the same that we experienced at our old newspaper. So the building which the newspaper occupied was very, very old and very Soviet. There were a lot of signs of past present in nowadays, and some discussions that older generations of journalists had also were very surprising. But at the same time, our section was called politics. So our chief our editor was a guy who was quite,
modern.
He was quite modern, and he was in his early 30s, as well as most of the journalists there. So it wasn't gloomy, it was very dynamic, and these people were journalists who got experience in the new times, so in the 90s. So they grew up as they grew up in free time, so they were independent. They all were independent journalists.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the building, and that the building itself was of interest. Tell us about the building.
This building was built by the Soviet authorities in the early 20th century, specifically to house this newspaper. That is why it had a huge sign Izvestia on top of the building. It's right on the Pushkin Square, and to Moscowites, Pushkin Square was always much more important than the Red Square. Nobody would ever had a meeting at Red Square because it's, to be honest, it's not where you usually go if you live in Moscow. But Pushkin Square was a place where everyone would have a meeting. It was the most familiar sign in the city, and of course the building, which was which looked like a rectangular grey, built in a brutalist style of the early 1920s, 1930s, was a striking presence on the square.
Mm-hmm. So you've built the book partly around your professional autobiographies and partly around a group of people you met at the beginning of Putin's presidency at Izvestia. So the result, it seems to me, has something in common with works of Russian literature, right? It reminds me a little bit of maybe a Chekhov narrative where you witness the trajectory of characters' aspirations over time. Maybe like a liberal variation on a Dostoevsky novel where you get to witness series of ideas and worldviews played out, tested against each other over time, with some personal and psychological motives attached. So since you've got this cast of characters, maybe a good way to start is by introducing the viewers to the main characters, not covering their whole lives, but what they were like when you first met them. So let's start with Yevgeny Krutikov, who was head of the political department at Izvestia.
Yes, he was editor in Izvestia, and he was a guy in his early 30s, as Irina already said. He was a very interesting guy, always a bit gloomy, with a very dry sense of humor, stooped, and he was, for instance, much taller than me, but it was really difficult to understand because the way he walked, and he looked much older than he was. Maybe it was deliberate because he wanted to look more intelligent and older. And always there was this sense of some tragedy around his figure. He had a photograph of his father at his table, at his desk. And almost immediately when we moved to his department, he told us a story, a very tragic story of his father. His father was from the Soviet elite, a son of deputy prime minister under Stalin, and he started a very interesting and very promising career in Soviet intelligence, but at some point he was arrested and sent to prison and spent many years in prison. And that affected Krutikov deeply. He developed a huge and acute interest in the world of intelligence, and at the same time he somehow had and kept a critical eye on what was going on back then in Russian intelligence.
Right, so it seemed that he had a wound connected with the end of the Stalin era, is that right?
Absolutely, and for us it was a very interesting phenomenon because, of course, Stalin purges and Stalin time affected all of us, all generations of Russians, and Irina family suffered deeply from both sides. So when we had a party and we were, as always Russians do, talked history and politics, at some point Irina confronted him with the question, you are servants of the regime.
Your family.
Your family. Mm-hmm. And Krutikov's response was very striking. He said, no, we are not servants. In our family are not servants. We are the regime. So for him, obviously, this sense of belonging to the Soviet elite was extremely important.
Mm-hmm. Maybe the most colorful character is Pyotr Akopov, who was the chief correspondent at the political department of Izvestia. Had a very strong interest in China and North Korea, nostalgic for Soviet influence in Africa, particularly Somalia, and called himself a Russian fascist, although I guess at the time you weren't sure if he was joking or not.
Yeah, when I heard this for the first time that he called himself a Russian fascist, I was sure that he is kind of kidding, and because he is an eccentric. Because the guy, he was a very charming personality. He was very mild mannered. He was softly spoken. He was wearing a huge heavy glasses. So he had very bad vision, and he looked like a real Russian intelligence. So when he proclaimed himself a Russian fascist, I thought that it's not for he wasn't serious. But later, when we developed our relationship, I was aware of his system of his ideology, which was quite different from ours. We always been liberals. We were liberals. We are still liberals, very liberal. But he has never been. And the newspaper when we worked for was quite liberal, and that his view on the world was so strange. He was fascinated by the North Korea. I mean, to the point at this times, like it was the early 2000s, I have never heard that anybody discuss this issue with me, because the North Korea, what's going on there? It considered back then, it considered like a very ancient past. So, and he was very interested in Russian history and Russia, especially in the history of Russian Empire and Russian nationalists, and so we talked a lot, and in this way, he looked a very interesting person to me. And he wasn't like just so old Soviet style person. He was not. He still has a wife who was very bohemian and loved to organize parties. She was a blonde, beautiful, always wearing red lipstick, and this couple was kind of very attractive. They were entertainment, so they loved music. So they were smoking a lot, partying a lot. So it was not like just you met a Russian fascist. No, it was not like that. And so he was one of the people who agreed to talk to us when we started writing the book. And given the fact that he is a journalist who has been working for years for a Russian for the Russian propaganda agency called RIA Novosti. So this is a state-owned agency. So I think that I was very happy that he agreed to talk to me, because we were in London, we were in exile, we were. Andrei was put on the wanted list by the authorities, so that definitely we were on the other side of the history. And we talked to him. He answered to many of my questions. But the problem is that Petr Akopov is a guy who wrote an article calling for the final solution to the Ukrainian question, which reminds us of a language of Hitler and Nazi Germany. And my father's family came
right,
from...
so that's literal Russian fascism, yeah.
Yeah, that's literal Russian fascism. And his article was so radical, even by the Kremlin standards, that the agency removed the article next day, so after it was published. So this kind of guy, Petr was. So the problem is that my father came from Ukraine, and all his family, my cousins, my aunties, many people, they still live in Odessa or Odessa region, and I am very aware of what's going on there from my family. They're suffering there. And my elderly aunt, who is 88 years old, she lives in Izmail, which is a small town on the river Danube, and she lives on she lives on her own, and when the town comes under Russian missile and drone attacks, she prefers to spend her nights out rather than stay at home, because she is afraid of being buried under the rubbles. So, and this is the
Yeah, of
reality
course.
I live in. Beyond the whole fact that the Russian war against Ukraine is just a huge tragedy. It's terrible. So I had a serious interview with Sveta, and at the last interview, my last question was, I explained him the situation. I told him about my family, and I asked him, "What do you think about this?" And his answer was very, very sincere. He told me that, "Oh, I'm very sorry about your family. It's a real tragedy. I'm very sorry for your people." And this is the same tragedy that we had when the Russian Revolution happened in the 1917. But he stopped for a while, he paused, and then he said, "But we could not stop. We must go further." And that was the end of our conversation. So, and after that, I lost my ability to talk for a while, for several hours.
Yeah, I quite understand. I'll come back to the present and, well, the last 25 years of Russian history a bit later. But let's continue with the first impressions of these characters. Yevgeny Baranov, war reporter, had been in Chechnya, was also with Putin on 9/11. Tell us about him.
Yeah, Yevgeny Baranov, we met him thanks to Peter Kopov. He is and was his closest friend, and we shared lots of time together. So when we had our parties usually at Kopov's apartment on Gogolevsky Boulevard, organized by Marina, Peter's wife, Baranov was there. And he was, back then, he was a very tall, very thin guy with a figure which reminded me of Don Quixote, because he was extremely tall with a very beautiful, deep voice. And that probably made him, and also the fact that he was extremely brave, a really good war reporter. So when we met, he was fresh from Chechnya, and at the time the Second Chechen War was still going on, and he was full of war histories, which was extremely important and interesting for us, because it was also our topic, what the Russian intelligence agencies and the security services were doing there. He was also, and that became very clear almost immediately, very interested in, in getting access to the Russian elites. For instance, if we didn't have our parties in the winter at Kopov's apartment on Gogolevsky, and if, say, it would be the summer, he would always insist to drive to Rublovka, which is the neighborhood populated by the Russian celebrities, oligarchs, top-level officials. There are plenty of very fashionable restaurants there, but usually you don't go there because it's not your crowd. But Baranov was, and that was quite evident, that he wanted, and he was quite desperate to become a part of his crowd. Finally, he got it when he married, but his intention and his goal was evident from the day one.
Right. Tell us about his partner, Olga Lyubimova.
Well, I can.
He met the girl, and very soon Baranov is older than Olga, 10 years older than Olga, and so it was a huge difference. She was a student when he met her, and they married very soon after it happened, like maybe a year passed or not longer, and they had very soon they had children, the son, and
a daughter.
and after that a daughter, and that's very interesting because she was 20 years old, 21 years old, so she was a girl, and she came from theatrical Bohemian, very educated liberal family. Her great granddad was a famous Soviet actor, and his popularity was so huge that a street in Moscow was named after him. So, and her father was a chief of actor school, which is kind of a position in Moscow. So, because theater and cinematography is very popular in Russia. So, she looked like a very bohemian person. When I first met her, I remember that she was wearing shoes in the form of hoofs, and she explained me why she did this. She explained to me why she was wearing such kind of shoes. So she was a chain smoker. Also, we drank a lot together. So she looked like fine, and because she was much younger than those guys, like 10 years younger. So she didn't have any nostalgia for the Soviet Union. These people, the older men, her husband and his friend Peter, they were very nostalgic for the Soviet Union, but it's not like they loved the Communist Party or the Soviet regime. That's not, but they missed the lost superpower status of the Soviet Union that Soviet Union had back then. So she did not. She was, but what was kind of very strange, I would say, about her, that she went to the Orthodox school when she was younger, and that was not usual. It was for the first time I met a person who, instead for normal state school, went to Orthodox church, and so I guess that Orthodoxy influenced her a lot. So she's now a minister of culture of the Russian Federation and involved very much into a lot of dirty things like war promotion and re-educating programs of the kids on the occupied territories.
Yeah. And then we've got Sveta Babayeva, who was part of Putin's press pool. Ended up spending a lot of time in the West. But I mean, it seems from your story that she was kind of covering for Putin from very early on, for example, during the Kursk disaster.
Yes, she was what we call a member of the presidential pool, meaning a group of journalists who always accompany the Russian president Yeltsin and then Putin to all his travels. And that gives an enormous personal access to the Kremlin, to the Kremlin officials, but also, obviously, to Vladimir Putin. And apparently it was extremely important for Sveta Babayeva, and she started her career when Russian president was Boris Yeltsin. But when Putin became president, she came very close to him, and apparently she enjoyed this access. To the point that she told us at the time that she was really proud and happy that Putin asked for her advice in the choice of tie, for instance, and she also accompanied him to Sochi, which, it's a resort town on the Black Sea, beloved by Putin from the day one. And she was there when the submarine Kursk sank, and it became such a huge tragedy for everyone in Russia, not because it was such an unheard thing. Of course, tragedies happened before, but because it looked like it was happening real time, because there was a hope for days that maybe
Right.
some sailors would survive. And it was not entirely clear when they died. There was this hope, and apparently there was an attempt to save their lives. And when finally it all we all realized that it was futile and all of them died, Sveta got back to Moscow and she told us at a meeting of our department that Putin, and it was sort of a mystery for many Russians, why Putin was not talking to the Russian media, why he was not present on the Russian television, why he was absent during the first several days of this tragedy. And she told us a story that he was absent because he was undergoing some surgery, some transplantation of his hair. And that was such a huge shock for us. Well, so in the middle of a national tragedy, you have a president who was busy with transplanting his hair. But what was even more striking, that the newspaper decided not to publish the story. So we, very early on, we understood that, yes, as a newspaper we joined in had some access to the Kremlin, but there were limits. And these limits were getting more and more visible.
Yeah. Well, the story seems in character, given what we've learned about Putin since. So even in the early stages of your book, it's evident that there's a difference in outlook between you and your Izvestia colleagues. Their attitudes to both Putin and, in some cases, the Stalinist past are more positive. And you ended up leaving Izvestia. Then you founded Agentura, where you were focused on the intelligence agencies. How did your friends react to that?
Well, initial reaction was actually quite positive. Krutikov, he agreed to join because the idea was not to have a, say, traditional media as we understand the online media today, but to have a place where you can collect as much information about Russian security services as possible. So part of our approach was to talk to journalists in different Russian media, not only in Moscow but also in Russian regions, and to ask them to give us their stories and specifically the names and the information, the data about the FSB, the biggest Russian security agency, so we can sort of, in a way, build a picture to fill the gaps about what we know about this huge organization. And it is huge because it's not only in Moscow, as I said, it's also in the regions. So we asked Krutikov if he would be willing to share with us what he knew about the FSB, his articles he already published, and he agreed. Petya Kopov also said he would be happy to contribute, and he wrote several articles for our website. Baranov, I think, was also quite positive. I don't think what we had a conversation about our website with Sveta Babayeva because she always been accompanying Putin to some travel, so we saw her not very often. But most of our friends were quite quite positive about our website.
Mm-hmm. So another work that your book reminded me of was Czesław Miłosz's The Captive Mind. So this is a book from the early 1950s in which the Polish poet who had moved to America offered case studies of Polish writers and how they had adapted to life under both German occupation and post-war Stalinism. Your book covers 25 years of modern Russian history, so that's terrorist attacks in Moscow and Beslan, wars in Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, the assassinations of Anna Politkovskaya, Alexander Litvinenko, Boris Nemtsov, Navalny, of course, the crushing of the major protest movement that began in 2011. So let's look at how some of your friends responded to those incidents, starting again with Krutikov turning up in Beslan.
When we met him in Beslan, it was a place where school was captured by terrorists, and the the tragedy. It started on the 1st of September, the first day when it's at the beginning of the school year in Russia. So it was so terrible, and we spent all the time. Baranov, Andrei, me. We spent all the time circling around the school, trying to get closer to the place of the terrorist attack and to have some access to the school, definitely. And the next day, or maybe the last day, I don't. It was 3 days, so it was the
second day we saw
day.
him, yes.
We saw Krutikoff, and we were very surprised because we have not seen him before. So, and we asked him, Zhenya, what are you doing here? And he told us that he came with the chief of South Ossetian Security Service. South Ossetia is a breakout republic from Georgia, so it's a disputed territories and a quite desolated one. And we was last a year ago he was a journalist, and a year passed, and he he introduced himself as a part of South Ossetian Security Services. That was just quite unusual, and that moment we understood that Zhenya is maybe drifting in an absolutely wrong direction, and we would never met. I mean, ideologically.
Right. And you also mentioned that he wrote something that, let's say, resonated strangely with Anna Politkovskaya's killing.
Yeah, it was much later when Zhenya was spending his time between Moscow and South Ossetia, where, as Irina said, he accepted the position of an advisor to the head of the South Ossetian security agency, fittingly called it the KGB of South Ossetia, and he was very proud of this position. But he was also trying to, because he's been always extremely ambitious, he wanted to start writing novels, spy novels. And at some point we shared his fascination for spy novels. He loved John le Carre. He would read all his novels in English because for him it was such a big thing. And at some point he wanted, maybe, to start a new career as a spy novelist. So he wrote his first novel, and when I heard of this novel and when I read it, it was, to be honest, quite shocking, because I read it after Anna Politkovskaya was killed. And the novel depicted basically that story, that a very liberal journalist was killed in Moscow, and that it was a conspiracy of Western and Ukrainian intelligence agencies, something like that. It was, of course, it was fiction, and the book was published and written before Anna Politkovskaya was killed. But nevertheless, the fact that he described such a killing in a way that Western intelligence agencies wanted to kill someone like Politkovskaya, and it was clear that he modeled his character of a Russian journalist on Politkovskaya, because Politkovskaya was obviously the most famous back then Russian journalist covering the war in Chechnya and the situation in Chechnya. That was quite astonishing. It gave me chills, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it had the same effect when I read it. Yeah. So Akopov, we've spoken about him quite a lot. Him putting you on the enemies list at one point. I guess the other really interesting point is his reaction to the 2011 protests. This is when he becomes more and more extreme, and he spoke about wanting to remove Navalny and blame it on the U.S.
Yeah, he did. But to that point, Petya was in a very harsh emotional situation because he lost some jobs and his new baby, he was waiting for the new baby and he needed money and worked desperately, and he got more and more aggressive and against the Russian opposition and the Russian liberals. And what was a very sad thing to us, and was that he reposted a list of, say, state enemies, and one of these people who was mentioned in this list were us, Andrei and me. That was the moment when we understood that our friendship just stopped, and we would never been friends.
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah. The other striking thing from around the time of those protests was Olga Lyubimova's resignation to the regime as it was, and the metaphor that she used. Tell us about that.
Well, Lyubimova at the time of the protest, 2010, 2011, she was a TV journalist, but not a political one. She was doing stories about the church, about society, about the city life, but of course she was very much involved in everything which was going on in Moscow, and the biggest thing which was going on in Moscow at the time was the protests, because it looked like everyone around you go to these protests. The place where we all were hanging out was called Jean-Jacques, named after Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and it was we might call it a sort of French brasserie on Nikitsky Boulevard, right in the center of Moscow. So we all spent a lot of time in this place because that's where you would see your friends. And she, at the time of the biggest protests in the winter, December of the 2010, she posted what she called Lyubimova's manifesto on her socials, and back then it was Live Journal, the most popular social media at the time. And she wrote in this manifesto that, look, I see many of my friends who are hanging out in Jean-Jacques going to the streets to protest. I don't see a point. I don't understand why they're doing that, because I, as a Russian woman, I was born in Moscow, in a country called Russia, long accepted a concept that in such a country, I'm quoting close to her text, the only way to survive is to behave as a woman being raped. You just need to spread your legs and try to enjoy it. And given the fact that she was a very young woman, a mother of 2 kids, living in Moscow, to use such a metaphor describing her relationship with the power in Russia was really astonishing.
Is that something that other people in Russia say? Like, is that a common metaphor, or did it stand out as something really unusual?
Not at all. It's very unusual to use a metaphor of rape. So usually people don't do that, especially educated people. And I guess that what she wrote back then was what she felt, and she was so sincere and so honest about her feeling and about her thinking. So that was, and the fact that she posted this on her publicly available blog, it's just astonishing, and it gave us an explanation what's really going on in the mind of people who sided with Putin in this terrible war, and they decided consciously to contribute to this war rather than live their private lives, which was also possible.
Yeah, I wish I had Putin's quote to hand, but didn't Putin make a rape-like analogy to his intentions in Ukraine in the early days of the war?
Yes, he used a very nasty line what sometimes Russian men use, in Russian it means, it sounds like nравится, не нравится, so meaning do you like it, or if you don't like it, it doesn't matter, because you need to accept that.
It's a metaphor of rape.
It's a clear metaphor of rape. So you need to enjoy it, whatever you like it or not.
Yeah. Right. So in other words, she saw the state the way the state sees itself, in a sense.
Yes.
True.
Yeah. And then we've got Sveta Babayeva, who goes on a kind of interesting trajectory. She's living in London for a while. She's very attracted to the British way of life, to a certain kind of liberal way of life. Then she ends up in Washington, where she's actually wielding some influence with American diplomats during the Obama era, during the reset. And then she ends up in Crimea.
Yes.
Having actually expressed some misgivings, some worries about the occupation of Crimea in 2014, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, but she ends up living there, doing special forces training, and then apparently being killed in a firearms accident on a shooting range.
Yeah, it's her journey is probably, to me, it's probably the most revealing in the way the Putin system works these days, and how brutal it is, not only towards, say, the Ukrainians or ordinary Russians, but also to those people who decided to serve the regime, even in high positions. So Babayeva, thanks to her access to the Kremlin, she got back in the 1990s, she met some very good friends with people in very high positions. One of his friends was Sergei Ivanov, who was a very influential figure in the early 2000s and 2010s, because he was a close friend of Putin. He also was a KGB general, while Putin was just a colonel. So he was always very on the very top. He served in, he got several positions from Putin. For instance, at some point he was Minister of Defense, and at some point he was the head of the presidential administration. At some point he was even seen as a possible successor to Vladimir Putin. That's how influential Sergei Ivanov was. So he provided his protection and his support to Babayeva. And that's how she got her positions in London and Washington, D.C. The interesting thing was that apparently these two postings affected her more deeply than she expected. So when she got back to Moscow, and it was exactly the time when we got the annexation of Crimea, she was more liberal than we expected her to be. And she wrote several articles openly saying that she's not enjoying the level of aggression she saw in Russian society. She was also writing something about the doors, that everywhere in Russia you see closed doors, while in the West you would see a more open approach to everything. And she wrote several articles criticizing the very fact of the annexation. What happened next was that her big friend Sergei Ivanov lost his position as the head of the administration of the president, and as a consequence, Babayeva was expelled to Crimea, to a very small town of Simferopol. But apparently, when she was there, she was getting more and more desperate, because she lost her access to power. She lost her access to the Kremlin. And apparently to the people who used to have this access, it's a sort of a drug. People really enjoy it. That they can, be so close to people who actually make big decisions. And she was looking for the substitution of that drug elsewhere. So she started training with special forces. I think she started with horses. Then it was climbing of the mountains. Then it was knife fighting. And finally it was special forces training. And she got really good at it, at the point that she wanted to start her own private military company. And then we got February 2022. She was in Simferopol when the Russian forces invaded Ukraine. And what we got from her friends who talked to her at the time, apparently she wanted to go to the war, but not as a propagandist, not as an embedded journalist, as a soldier. And she was going through her final training when she got killed by, as you said, a friendly fire on a shooting range. And again, for us, it's just a very good reflection how brutal the system became. Apparently, she was so desperate to get back to the Kremlin and to win back the Kremlin's support that she lost her life. Well, thanks God she never had a chance to kill anyone in Ukraine. That's one good outcome of this tragedy, but still it is a tragedy.
So you've touched on your efforts, for the sake of the book, to get in touch with your old contacts, and you've talked about speaking to Petya Akopov. Tell us about your efforts to get in touch with the others.
Unfortunately, the Ministry of Culture refused to talk to us, and she did it in a very...
That's Lyubimova, yeah.
That's Lyubimova, and she did it in very interesting form. We sent her a message on her personal phone, which we checked with her friends, and she pretended to be her press office. And her response was just this, that you send your questions to the press office and the response will follow. So this kind of things, like completely official, meaningless response. So, and Baranov, he responded to us, and he said
you, actually.
to me, and he sent the message that he was always a very artistic guy, so his response was kind of very not direct, like, oh guys, I respond to Irina, I respond to you. I can't. He refused to talk to me because he told that I am a foreign agent, so he, as a state official, are not allowed to talk to me. And I tried to continue conversation to get more sustainable response or something, or maybe involve him in some conversations. And he told me that, I said, thank you very much for talking to me, blah, blah, blah. And he told me, we are all Russian people. And so we always been, in this kind of, we've always been in some kind of communications as Russian people in the world. So that was the response, but he refused to talk. He refused to give me an interview.
But he, at the same time, he attacked us, saying, well, yes, we found, because Irina texted him something about, like, the main goal of the book is to understand why we found ourselves on the different sides of politics, of history, but also of
different side of the border.
And he said, that's you who found yourself on the other side. We are here.
Yeah.
So he used and tried to use this conversation to attack us.
Yeah.
Krutikov responded, and we had many conversations with him, and many very long conversations.
Tell us about them.
Well, initially he said, when I texted him, he said, well, you know that I'm harming my karma. I've been responding to you. But because I've known Krutikov for so many years, I sensed that actually he was open for a conversation. Because at some point when we were having an interview with some Russian media in exile, and we were having it on Zoom, on YouTube. So I noticed that in comment session, there was a comment made by Krutikov. So for me, it was a sign that he obviously wanted to re-establish our connection, and that's why I approached him directly and said, "Look, maybe we can talk about what happened to all of us and what happened to the country." And he was very pleased after his comment about karma. And the only thing which worried me that he always insisted to have my camera on, and because I already knew that he worked very closely with Russian military intelligence, not only South Ossetian but also Russian military intelligence. And for instance, now he is writing a lot about the activities of the Russian military advisors and private military companies in Africa. So I was a bit cautious about what I can actually show him in terms of where I live and how we live and our circumstances. I didn't want to give him a lot of details so it would be possible to establish, for instance, where I live for security reasons. But he actually was, I think, very open with me. And at some point I asked him, because he was extremely aggressive towards liberal journalists and liberal media, and he blamed everything on Russian liberal media. For him, they were the main culprit and everything which went wrong in the country. So at some point I asked him, don't you think, Zhenya, that yes, I understand your position, but don't you think that now nobody among Russian journalists, and we are not talking anymore about independent journalists or critical journalists, but even pro-Kremlin journalists do not have any access to the Kremlin anymore. Apparently, the Kremlin is not really interested to give this access to anyone. So even if we are thinking about our profession in a very cynical way, that you sided with the Kremlin to get this access, you failed, because nobody now enjoys this kind of access. And he said, yes, I admit that's probably the case. But again, he said, well, liberals are to blame for that.
Yeah, I was struck by his phrase, a big tank crushing everyone. This is how he described what life in Russia now.
Yes.
It reminded me of, sorry?
Yes, please continue.
Yeah. It reminded me of the phrase from 1984 where the interrogator O'Brien refers to a boot stamping on a human face forever. So the big tank crushing everyone, I guess that's a pretty close approximation of that. Maybe we can, since we're running short on time, maybe we can finish with Orwell. So one of Orwell's best essays was called The Prevention of Literature. And it was a criticism of the influence of Soviet socialist realism and Stalinist jargon on British intellectuals. In the essay, he refers to Ilya Ehrenburg and Alexei Tolstoy as literary prostitutes who traded freedom of expression for money. But the impression that emerges from your book is somewhat different. So it's of people who receive paid work and safety from Putin's regime, but they're also committed ideologues who have ways of rationalizing to themselves what they're doing. And I wonder, how conscious are your friends of the way that different incentives drive them, like the role of punishment and reward in their lives? What do you think?
I think that they're smart and highly educated people, so they're very aware of what they're doing and why they did this. So we discussed a lot for what are the reasons and what are the reasons for their behavior and why they decided to side with Putin in this terrible war and with the Kremlin. And the reasons for that, and we concluded, we made three conclusions. The first one, that these people are very nostalgic about the lost superpower status of the Soviet Union. And Putin, because Putin is tried to create the new Russian Empire, so that's why they supported him. The second reason is that they just don't believe in Russian people. They don't believe that Russian people are able to create a great state without a dictator, like Stalin or Peter the Great or Putin. And which is also very important for them, that they, being smart people, they understand the advantage of being close to the power. So that's not all about money. That's power, that's influence, and money. I don't think the money is on the first place. That's not.
No, no. Actually, when you talk to them, you think that you are talking to someone who would fit really well the political landscape of, say, Western Europe somewhere in the 15th century, when you do not have a lot of, the society didn't play a big role, where you have collections of dictators or kings or czars or princes, and the only way to make a mark, and all of these people, as Irina said, are extremely ambitious, is to serve the prince. And that's what they think about the present political climate in the country.
That seems like a good place to leave it. Thanks, Andrei and Irina. So here is the book, Our Dear Friends in Moscow. It's great. I really recommend it. So your articles, I'm seeing them in The Guardian, on the CEPA website, Center for European Policy Analysis, Foreign Affairs. Foreign Affairs has also put the book among their, what was it, top 3 for the past year, something like that?
Yes. Yeah, very grateful to them.
Yeah, so congratulations on that. You're both on X. I can also be found on X at Roland E. Brown, Instagram at Roland Elliott Brown, The Orwellians Substack, theorwellians.substack.com. I'm also hoping that the Orwellians podcast will be user supported. So I've put a donate link under the YouTube video. And that's about it. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you very much for having us here. Thank you. It was
Thank you,
a pleasure
Roland.
talking to you. Thank you.